Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you please introduce yourself and spell your last name for the record?
My name is Epi Leonard. Last name spelled Leonard.
What do you do for a living, doctor?
I'm a family practitioner. I have my own practice out at Steelton Medical Center.
Could you tell us a bit more about the work that you do at your practice?
Sure. As a family practitioner, I've been trained to treat a wide range of illnesses, from things as small as cuts and bruises to things as big as severe head trauma.
What's your educational background?
I received my bachelor's in biochemistry from Steelton University, and then I went on to get my MD from Steelton University Medical School, and I completed my residency at Steelton University General Practice.
As a family practitioner, are you qualified to diagnose seizures?
Absolutely. Patients often go to their family practitioner who can diagnose them from their symptoms or order further diagnostic testing.
Doctor, I'd like to shift gears and start talking about this case. How are you involved?
I was asked by Mr. Stansfield to conduct an evaluation of Dr. Condon's treatment of Mr. Bobby Daly.
What information did you have available for that evaluation?
I had the depositions, the medical records, the police report, and a medication data sheet for the drug gabapentin.
And once you had all that information together, what did you do with it?
I formed an opinion using the ACT method.
The ACT method, what is that, doctor?
Well, ACT is an acronym. It stands for Assessment, Communication, and Treatment.
Well, I want to walk the members of the jury through each step of that evaluation. What does the A stand for and what does it entail?
The A stands for assessment. I looked at Mr. Daly's symptoms, and then I looked at the initial and final diagnosis from Dr. Condon. And then I used the relevant data to come to a conclusion.
What about that next letter, the next step, the C? What does that stand for?
Communication.
And what is that step of the evaluation?
I looked at Mr. Daly's description of his symptoms, and then I looked at Dr. Condon's characterization of those symptoms. And then I looked at the relevant medical data.
And what about the T? What does that stand for?
It stands for treatment.
And what does that step entail?
I looked at the long-term and the short-term treatment plan that Dr. Condon made for Mr. Daly, and then I looked at the relevant medical data to see if it was appropriate.
Doctor, is this ACT methodology a reliable methodology in the field?
Yes, we were taught it in medical school and throughout my residency.
And did you apply it reliably in this case specifically?
Absolutely.
So, doctor, after you conducted your ACT evaluation, did you come to any conclusions in this case?
I did.
And did you come to those conclusions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
Doctor, could you tell the members of the jury what those conclusions were?
I concluded that Dr. Condon breached the standard of care in two primary ways. The first, Dr. Condon recognized the symptoms of a seizure disorder and in Mr. Daly, but failed to conduct further diagnostic testing to confirm. Second, Dr. Condon had a duty to report Mr. Daly to the Steelton Department of Transportation the moment he knew Mr. Daly was suffering from seizures, and he failed to do that.
Doctor, before we get into your conclusions, I want to get the members of the jury a better understanding of exactly what we're talking about here. So, doctor, what is a seizure?
A seizure is a paroxysmal disruption of the cerebral functions characterized by altered consciousness, altered motor activity, or behavior that's inappropriate for the individual.
I'm sorry, doctor. For those of us who did not graduate from medical school, what does all that mean?
My apologies. It can be a little confusing, but all that a seizure is any sudden disruption of the brain functions that result in things like memory loss, collapsing, or headaches.
All right, well, I want to dive right into your conclusions. You said that the first conclusion was that the defendant recognized the symptoms of a seizure disorder. How do you know that?
From the medical records. The defendant made note in his medical records that Bobby's symptoms were suggestive of a seizure disorder. And from those 4 visits, he made note of them in almost each of those visits.
Doctor, would you recognize those medical records from those 4 visits if you saw them today?
I would.
Doctor, could you open up that binder in front of you to tab 3?
Okay.
Could you flip through those pages and just check the 4 medical records are there?
They are.
And is that all of them?
This is all of them, yes.
Do they appear to be fair and accurate copies?
They do?
Your Honor, we offer Exhibit C. No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, Exhibit C will be admitted today's date without objection.
So, Doctor, I want to start with the first visit. What date was that?
It was on June 22nd, 2015.
And at that visit, according to the medical records, did the defendant recognize the symptoms of the seizure disorder?
The defendant did. He made note that the symptoms were indicative of a seizure disorder, but he didn't order any further diagnostic testing. Instead, he initially diagnosed Mr. Daly with post-concussion syndrome.
Well, Doctor, if the defendant diagnosed Mr. Daly with post-concussive syndrome, what makes you believe that he recognized those symptoms as those of a seizure disorder?
Well, based on the note, he also prescribed Mr. Daly gabapentin, which is a seizure medication. It would be odd for a doctor to prescribe a seizure medication to treat anything other than a seizure disorder.
Why would that be odd?
Well, out of all the medication available to treat Mr. Daly's symptoms, a doctor has better options available to them. Using a seizure medication to treat anything other than seizure disorder doesn't make the most sense.
Doctor, you said that there were 4 visits between Mr. Daly and the defendant. How did Mr. Daly's symptoms develop over the course of those 4 visits?
Well, unfortunately, they got worse. By the 3rd visit, Mr. Daly was displaying troubling signs of altered consciousness.
Could you describe to the members of the jury exactly what those signs were?
Absolutely. Mr. Daly described 4 to 5 instances where the last thing he remembered was sitting on the couch watching TV. And then the next thing he remembers is lying on the ground. There was also an instance where the last thing he remembered was standing in the shower, and the next thing he remembered, he was lying on the ground. Those are troubling signs of altered consciousness, which is highly indicative of a seizure disorder.
Why is that highly indicative of a seizure disorder?
Well, remember how earlier I said a seizure is any sudden disruption of your brain functions? Well, that's exactly what happened here. Based on Mr. Daly's symptoms, it seems like he lost consciousness and collapsed. That's a seizure.
Based on your experience, a family practitioner who was presented with a patient who on numerous occasions collapsed, what should that doctor do?
That doctor should diagnose their patient with a seizure disorder, or at the very least, order further diagnostic testing to confirm.
What did the defendant do in this case?
He didn't diagnose Mr. Daly with a seizure disorder, and he didn't order further diagnostic testing to confirm. Instead, he characterized those instances as memory loss, which isn't an accurate depiction of what was going on.
Well, what about that seizure medication you mentioned earlier today, gabapentin? Did the defendant continue to prescribe that medication to Mr. Daly?
He did. In fact, at that same visit where Mr. Daly was displaying symptoms of collapsing, he doubled the dosage. But what was really troubling is that Dr. Condon said that he was using the medication to treat memory loss,
Why was that troubling?
because gabapentin doesn't treat memory loss.
Well, what does gabapentin treat?
Seizures.
So after the defendant prescribed this anti-seizure medication, gabapentin, did Mr. Daly's seizure symptoms decrease?
They did. At the very next visit, his symptoms, they got better, but they were still there.
So doctor, help me understand this one. If the defendant prescribed anti-seizure medication, gabapentin, and the patient's seizure symptoms improved, why was that not enough to meet or to act within the standard of care?
Because the standard of care requires that a physician diagnose their patient or conduct further diagnostic testing to confirm the existence of a seizure disorder. The defendant did nothing.
All right, Doc, I want to move on to the second conclusion that you formed, that the failure to report Mr. Daly to the Department of Transportation constituted a breach of the standard of care. Based on your review of this case, was the defendant aware of his duty to report patients?
Yes, the defendant was aware of his duty to report a patient if they've suffered a single seizure.
And doctor, why is the failure to report a patient to the Department of Transportation a breach of the standard of care?
Because the standard of care requires that a physician report their patient if they're a danger to others on the road, such as seizure disorder, so that their license can be taken away until they get better. Based on the defendant's notes and medical records, he was aware that his patient may be suffering from seizures. His failure to act, that was the breach of the standard of care.
Thank you for your time, doctor. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Very well, thank you.